8,000 miles from Britain, a bleak and desolate treeless waste on the far side of the world. A place Her Majesty's Royal Marines already knew well, but were about to get to know a lot better. A place that was, despite their glorious past, to save them from possible extinction. This was the Falkland Islands, where the Union Jack had flown continually for nearly 150 years, despite rumblings of discontent from South America. Rich in wildlife, where untold numbers of penguins and other ice cap escapees came once a year to live alongside fewer than 2,000 introverted islanders. All of them fighting for a frugal existence against the near Antarctic elements. Like the early days of Australia, the economy was built on wool and mutton. But unlike the Australians, the Falkland Islanders had been unable to conquer their environment and move forward. Their culture, economy and aspirations stayed static. All they ever wanted was to be left alone in peace.
We just feel British. We are British. And there's no way we would change our nationality. No way at all.
None of which deterred Argentina, a mere 400 miles away, from insisting that the islands belong to Buenos Aires, not London, on historical and territorial grounds. So, for many a long year, a token force of Royal Marines, for it was never anything more than that, had been stationed near Port Stanley, without any real hope of thwarting an Argentinian invasion.
We take it fairly seriously, but on the other hand, as you know, to defend against a full-scale Argentinian threat would be hopeless. We just simply hadn't got the manpower to do it.
The Marines were simply a reassurance to the islanders of Britain's avowed intentions that they should remain British for as long as they wanted. And they unanimously voted they did want to stay British. The Falkland Islands Defence Force was established and trained by the Marines, again with more hope of demonstrating proud intentions than ever being able to carry them out. Friendships were forged, trusts were built, security of the islands was seldom mentioned, and Argentina was out of sight and, whenever possible, out of mind. But in Argentina, the military junta of General Leopoldo Galtieri was in trouble, possibly even on the verge of collapse. A political masterstroke was needed, and quickly. South Georgia, the tiny British protectorate 800 miles to the southeast of the Falklands, provided the answer. It was to become Galtieri's stepping stone to his recovery of the Malvinas. It was undefended, as there seemed to be no need to fortify an abandoned whaling station on the very edge of Antarctica. All that stood in the way was the aging Royal Navy guard ship Endurance, with a small detachment of Royal Marines on board. Buenos Aires gambled that a secret move onto South Georgia could not and would not be challenged by so insignificant an opposition. They were to be proved wrong on both counts. And so, when a scrap metal dealer by the name of Konstantino Davidov arrived unannounced with 41 dismantlers at the old whaling station at Leith on March the 18th, he was accompanied by Argentinian soldiers. Their intentions were obvious. Britain was informed that any attempt to remove Davidov's party would be resisted. The South Atlantic War had started. Few doubted from the warlike stance now being adopted by Argentina that Galtieri was preparing a plan of invasion for the Falkland Islands. Britain, meanwhile, was openly seeking a diplomatic solution, but not so openly dusting off the military options. Endurance left her Marines on another part of South Georgia with orders simply to maintain a British presence and to keep an eye on the Argentinians. Then she steamed westwards. But she was only halfway towards the Falklands when at 6 a.m. on Friday, April the 2nd, the Argentinians invaded. The Marines there, under Major Mike Norman, had prepared for an attack from the airfield and the beaches to the east of Stanley. So they were wrongly placed when the first explosions and signs of advance came from their barracks at Moody Brook to the west. The Marines regrouped rapidly at Government House to find the Argentinians already there.
It was a very frightening experience. They were 10 yards away from us within about 10 minutes. I think we all very quickly came to terms with the fact that we were probably going to die in the next half an hour. I certainly did. Once you came to terms with that, the feeling of fear disappeared, and you got on and you did your job.
What was the immediate reaction of the people in Stanley?
It was shock, I think, because we'd only been told literally 6 or 7 hours beforehand that we were going to be invaded, and things went like clockwork. We were invaded exactly on dawn, as the governor told us, and people were absolutely stunned by the whole thing. We just sort of walked about, not like zombies, but certainly in a state of shock, because it was all happening all around us. That which you normally see on the pictures was happening outside on the pavement. You know, the Royal Marines, for instance, going along past the fire station there, having a firefight with some Argentines who were coming down King Street. And it was so dramatic that none of us really looked at the danger aspect of it. We all got upstairs in the bedroom windows for a better look, and felt very stupid afterwards, and felt a bit better next day when we found that half the town had been doing the same thing.
It was a brave but short-lived resistance. No Marines had been hurt, but they'd killed 5 Argentinians, wounded at least 17 more, and taken 3 prisoners before being ordered by the governor to surrender. And all the time, more Argentinian Amtrak armoured personnel carriers kept on arriving in Stanley. The governor, Rex Hunt, with an almost quaint British gesture of defiance, refused to shake hands with the deputy Argentinian commander, Admiral Carlos Busa.
He came along and held his hand out to me, and I refused to take it. I said, I do not shake hands with an invader of British territory. And he looked very angry. His cheeks were twitching like mad, and I could see he was holding himself in with great restraint, and he was very proper, and he said, I think it's very ungentlemanly not to shake hands. And I said, I think it's very uncivilized for you to invade our country.
And so the Falklands had become the Malvinas in just a couple of hours, and the islanders grudgingly accepted that things had changed. The once proud Falkland Islands Defence Force followed the example of the rest of the community and did nothing whatsoever to resist or fight back. Indeed, it was later proved that some islanders fed and sheltered the invaders and even helped to maintain their warplanes right through the war. It won them no friends in Britain. Galtieri's political problems seemed to be over. The recently hostile population now massed to sing his praises as the new saviour of the nation. His government was sure that Britain would never attempt anything other than diplomacy to try to regain the islands, and that, as possession was 9/10 of the law, he could argue his case at the United Nations forever. And with the nation and the armed forces solidly behind him and in indomitable mood, he felt there was little to worry about. His greatest coup had been achieved. His opposite number in London saw things considerably differently. Now there was to be no more hiding the plans to keep the Falklands British by whatever means. Mrs. Thatcher's government was also aware that diplomacy had to be the first line of attack, no matter how useless a weapon it might prove to be. But now there wasn't to be 1 second wasted in preparing and sending a military force. The Royal Marines who were to spearhead the military response were spread far and wide. Some were just back from a typically arduous tour of West Belfast and were looking forward to a spell of leave. But the first decision had been made in Whitehall to send an amphibious force led by 3 Commando Brigade. In effect, it was the only option realistically available for a military campaign against what would be heavily defended islands on the other side of the world. This was all a far and distant cry from Belfast, where at least the opposition spoke English and there were buildings and trees to take cover behind. But the moment Port Stanley fell, the order went out for the Royal Marines to prepare for war. Some Marines took a little convincing that it really was for real.
We had the Wandering Patrol come round and said, wake up lads, because the Argies have invaded the Falklands. So we all told them to, get lost near enough. And because April Fools was finished at the time, and they was going, come on, they was pleading with us, please get up, there's a war on. And we just wouldn't get out of our bed, and it did take an officer to come and get us out of our beds.
I got home, saw a bit of the telly then and noticed that the threat was actually there and something could be going on. So I told the wife, I said, look, something might be going on here. could be going on onto a war system, or war footing with the Argentinians. She sort of laughed, you know, so I sort of shrugged off at the same time, thinking, well, it's going to be impossible, this. England will never go to war.
On the Saturday, I'd been out shopping with the missus down into Plymouth, and I come back, there was a note through my door off the troop sergeant. It was Fred Poyser saying, come back to camp, you're going down the Falklands. So of course, like, I just left all the stuff, all the shopping, had a burger full of frozen food that I just threw on the kitchen floor, says I'm off.
From Arbroath in Scotland to Plymouth in Devon, the preparations were hectic. The Special Boat Squadron were the first away, only to be held up frustratingly for over 2 weeks, while one means of getting them onto the Falklands, a submarine, could be moved into place near the islands. The P&O flagship, Canberra, was requisitioned and transformed into a troopship, complete with 3 helicopter flight decks in less than 3 days. The Great White Whale, as she became affectionately known by the Marines, was about to enter the most exciting chapter of her life, and to have her name etched forever into the history of the Corps. Three Commando Brigade was to be augmented by the 3rd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, and they too were to sail south in Canberra, in an attempt to get the Marines and Paras to like and trust each other before the fighting started. It was perhaps the only major failure of the campaign. All roads led to Southampton, or Portsmouth, where the task force, as it was now dubbed, was getting ready for sea. Men and stores were crammed into ships of every shape and size. And in the rush to get going, a great deal of kit was put into the wrong ships. But that could all be sorted out later, said those in charge. This was a logistic nightmare which never went away. Then, just 3 days after the Argentinian invasion, the one sight that Galtieri believed his fellow countrymen would never see, let alone so soon. A full-scale British force steaming away from England towards the Falklands. The Royal Navy was going to get them there, the Royal Marines were going to win them back.
To the South Atlantic! Quick! March!
When did you find out you couldn't get married today?
He phoned me on Friday and I had to cancel everything. I got everything, the flowers, everything.
When will you get married now?
I don't know, whenever he comes back. Let's just hope he does.
been a proud and an emotional send-off. 3 Commando Brigade was spread out amongst dozens of ships, none of them steaming flat out for the Falklands, but almost painfully slowly nudging gently southwards. The truth was that at this time, no orders or plans for landing on the islands, let alone retaking them, had been discussed or finalised. The politicians hadn't yet decided what to do, and the military hadn't looked in detail at the dozens of options. But Lieutenant Keith Mills and his Royal Marines detachment from HMS Endurance had already proved, quite convincingly, what Britain's intentions were. Lieutenant Mills and his 21 men had been put ashore at Grytviken on South Georgia, 16 miles from the new Argentinian base at the whaling station of Leith. The Argentinians expected Endurance to order her Marines to surrender to the soldiers from Leith. Their base ship, the Bahia Paraiso, even helped Captain Nick Barker get in touch with the Marines, confident he'd tell them to give up without a fight.
Grytviken, this is Endurance. I assume that you can hear me. Rules of engagement as stated earlier this morning. Defend if you are provoked. There should be no cause for confusion whatever.
But while Endurance waited offshore, Lieutenant Mills was highly confused by a new ambiguous set of orders which could be interpreted in many different ways. He decided to fight for as long as possible, then lead his men into the mountains and try to continue a guerrilla campaign. It was not to be, but their resistance before being surrounded and shelled was quite spectacular, including bringing down an Argentinian troop-carrying helicopter.
We fired everything we had at the helicopter, and a large amount of rounds went into it. Subsequently, the helicopter turned away with black smoke following it, and somehow managed to crawl about 500 meters across the bay and landed very heavily on the other side. It didn't explode, but no Marines were seen to disembark from the helicopter. A helicopter like that carries 22 men, so we put several hundred rounds into it.
They also holed and severely damaged the Argentinian corvette Gorico.
I decided to let it get very, very close, because by letting it get very, very close, it was absolutely committed to passing our position. And what's more, due to the shape of the bay, it was committed to turning around and passing our position for a second time. When it got to about within 200 to 300 meters, I ordered my men to open fire, and we opened fire with everything we had. The first round, the first 84mm round, actually landed slightly short by about 10 meters. After a second of initial dismay, we actually saw the round detonate on hitting the ship below the waterline. I believe it caused a lot of damage.
But in less than 3 hours, it was all over, and Lieutenant Mills's men were forced to surrender. They were flown back to England 20 days later, when they were greeted by the Commandant General, Sir Stuart Pringle. Their action won high praise and a Distinguished Service Cross for Lieutenant Mills. For the rest of the brigade, war seemed a million miles away. Instead of the freezing wastes of Antarctica, the task force was now in the tropics. Royal Marines pride themselves on never being far from peak fitness, and somehow it seemed a lot less arduous maintaining the standard aboard a luxury cruise liner in a sweltering 90 degrees. There was no real urgency yet about the daily routine. The diplomatic process was still being bounced around in London, Buenos Aires, and the United Nations. The military move south had slowed to a crawl. And after a workout on the flight deck, what better way to cool off than in one of Canberra's swimming pools? There was room for everyone and plenty of time to enjoy it. Sunbathing became almost a chore, although there were severe warnings about self-inflicted injuries if sunburn impeded efficiency. In the ship's restaurants, somehow the word mess seemed totally inadequate. Civilian P&O stewards waited on the fighting men with a choice of menu at each of the 3 main meals. The cuisine was far more in keeping with a luxury hotel than the cookhouse. And while the men endured their surroundings, more of the ship's company cleaned and scrubbed around them. They even made their beds for them and tidied up their cabins. If you had to go to war, this most certainly had to be the way. There was a civilian shop on board for all those little extras and luxuries that the quartermaster couldn't provide. And in the evenings, a sing-song, if for no other purpose than to remind each other what the real purpose of the trip was. Then a brief encounter with reality 2 weeks out from Southampton. The capital of Sierra Leone, Freetown, was to provide a sort of pit stop to refuel and replenish. No shore leave, no sightseeing, just a brief glimpse of Africa from the ship's rail, like space travellers peering momentarily at a different planet. One family of British exiles made the effort to come down to the fuel jetty and wave a Union flag, but they soon wished they hadn't. The young men on board made suggestions to one of their attractive visitors that were not only impractical, but quite illegal. The family tried to brazen it out, but were forced to give up and make a less than dignified retreat. The flying fish conditions continued right through the tropics to Ascension, where the task force was to regroup. Now, there was a submarine threat, and the Navy assumed the role of Good Shepherd for the undefended merchantmen. At last, the tension began to rise. Perhaps, just perhaps, there really was going to be a war. Ascension Island, like Freetown, proved to be a major disappointment to any Marines in search of excitement. A small volcanic dust pile in the middle of nowhere, Ascension was packed with British and American communications equipment, most of it highly secret. But Ascension also had an airfield and a safe anchorage, so it became the obvious staging post between Britain and the Falklands. It was here that thousands of tons of stores and equipment, which had been loaded into the wrong ships in England, were cross-decked and reloaded, often into other wrong ships. For 2 weeks, helicopters, landing craft, and the vast pontoon-like Mexi-floats plied endlessly to and fro between every ship in the task force, trying to unscramble the mess. The Marines managed to get off their ships for a few hours to fire their weapons and feel rock instead of metal beneath their feet. But in the main, Ascension provided the brigade with little more than another frustrating hold-up, although the senior officers were now at last beginning to formulate plans for a campaign on the Falklands. This was largely thanks to information which was coming back from the Special Boat Squadron, elements of which were now ashore and reporting from East Falkland. They'd been secretly inserted using their traditional methods, being brought close inshore by submarine or dropped from Hercules aircraft, exactly as they're seen doing here on a recent exercise. Any Marine can apply to join the squadron, but very few pass the rigorous selection procedure. If they do, they can expect 3 years working in some very strange places. They silently landed on the Falklands from rubber dinghies. Then their task was to stay hidden, yet to get close enough to the Argentinians to see what they were doing and in what strength. Discovery would have led to almost certain death. Later, they were to be told by radio what beaches had been chosen for the landings and then go and check them out. For obvious reasons, nearly all the work done by the SBS is at night and relies on covering a great deal of ground in a short space of time. They worked in small groups of 4 or 6, often in conjunction with their better-known army counterparts of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment. A cruel stroke of luck after the main force was ashore was to have an SBS unit coming across an SAS group unannounced, and 1 Marine died in the resulting firefight before the error was realized. It was all highly dangerous and unpleasant work for the elite men of an elite corps, but without them, the landings and the eventual move towards Port Stanley couldn't even have been considered. But the SBS were not the only visitors at this time. General Galtieri and his staff wanted to show the world that British rule was over, and so paid a flying visit to this, the newest part of Argentina. It was a great publicity coup, and proof to the world that the junta was consolidating its position. To British surprise, the SBS reported that far fewer armoured vehicles than had been expected were being ferried across to the islands, but there were far more men. 11,000 in fact, mostly conscripts, but nevertheless armed and for the time being very confident. They dug in around the islands and looked well-fed, well-equipped and in good spirits. At this time, they, like a lot of people in Britain, still refused to believe that it could ever come to a shooting war. They made no impression on the Falkland Islanders, who still treated them with a blank, impassive air of disinterest which they'd perfected over many years. the supplies kept on coming in from the mainland by sea and the air bridge to Stanley Airport. This was despite a massive operation by the RAF, as the runway stayed open throughout the war, as the Vulcan bombers had only managed to hit the strip with one bomb out of 63 dropped. The highly potent Pucara planes and others based at Stanley flew on uninterrupted until the end of the conflict. For 3 Commando brigades still basking in the tropics, life was far more pleasant. A sports day was organised on board Canberra, coincidentally on the day after she'd slipped quietly away from Ascension. Thoughts were far more about inter-unit pride and prowess than the fact that there was now nothing but a lot of sea between them and the Falklands. The blue-ribboned event was the 10,000 metres, an acknowledgement that this was the day of the London Marathon, and a great many men on board should have been pounding around the streets of the capital instead of the decks of Canberra, 4,000 miles south. The result was desperately important to participants and their supporters, even with the inclusion of such non-physical events as deck quoits. It was 4-2 Commando who carried the day, with their CO, Colonel Nick Vaux, taking the hurriedly made Victor's Shield and a couple of bottles of champagne. At the end of the afternoon, the impressive sight of one of the Type 21 frigates, as HMS Ardent drew alongside to give an impromptu firepower demonstration with her 4.5-inch gun. It was a heartening and a reassuring sight, with the ships now well into the South Atlantic and the possibility of contact with the Argentinian Navy and Air Force increasing by the hour. This morale-boosting sight would have had a very different effect if the onlookers had realized the proud little ship was a fortnight later to be hit by 12 Argentinian bombs in Falklands Sound and sink with 24 of her crew dead. But the mood had changed dramatically since leaving Ascension.
The drinking stopped, and then it was get all the kit sorted out, so it was more or less, this is getting a bit serious now, so we'll stop playing, because up until Ascension we never believed we'd really go in. And when they said, you know, hang around for 2 weeks at Ascension, we were really pissed off then, because 2 weeks wasted, they were fortifying the place and everything. So, you know, when they said go, that was it. Press button and stand back.
They tried to keep us as best informed as they could, but it was all pretty mundane stuff. UN talks falling over again and again, etc., and people storming out and not wanting to know, and people pushing for an invasion, people pushing against an invasion, and we were the sort of pigs in the middle, really. We just tried to train whenever we could, whenever the swells of the South Atlantic would allow us to, and prepare ourselves for the eventuality that, well, perhaps as we got closer and closer to the exclusion zone, that in fact we were going to land. And it wasn't until approaching the exclusion zone, I think, that the realization dawned, and you found your pockets full of grenades and things instead of bars of nutty and this sort of thing.
Now the training had an extra edge to it. The weapons which had been brought out at Ascension were tried and tested again and again. The infantryman's life in battle centres on his weapons. For the Marines, that meant the general-purpose machine gun, the Sterling submachine gun, and the basic self-loading rifle. These were the weapons that would win or lose any war which was to follow. Physical training was now no longer regarded as a boring nuisance. Each man knew his life could depend on his stamina. And while the ships continued with their anti-submarine manoeuvres, every available square inch of deck space was filled with Marines going through and practicing their various skills, preferably with a borrowed helicopter or two. Then the first real success for Britain, thanks to M Company of 4-2 Commando, the SBS and the SAS, the recapture of South Georgia in horrendous conditions. A whiteout on the island led to 2 troop-carrying helicopters crashing in the snow. Amazingly, there were no serious casualties. The frigate Plymouth bombarded the Argentinian positions, then Marines landed from the destroyer Antrim and the auxiliary Tidespring. The submarine Santa Fe was in the area, but took no part in the Argentinian defence after being hit by British gun and rocket fire. She limped badly damaged into Grytviken and later sank at her mooring. The Argentinian land forces had been expected to resist, but in the end, under the erroneous impression that far greater forces were coming to evict them, they gave up without firing a shot. It wasn't the proudest moment of their military history. Their commander, Captain Alfredo Astiz, signed the surrender. He was later allowed to go home with his men, despite some insistence in Britain that he be held to answer charges of torture and other atrocities committed before the war. M Company hoisted their flag under the Union flag and, with Endurance and Antrim safely in the bay, radioed back to London with the news which gave the government its first real cause to celebrate. The Prime Minister was not slow to mark the achievement.
What's your reaction? Rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Are we going
Good
to
night,
declare war on
gentlemen.
Argentina, Mrs. Thatcher?
Rejoice.
But there was no time to rejoice in the task force, where the sobering sight of hospital facilities being prepared could be seen where a few days earlier Marines had been enjoying a band concert. Now the members of the Commando Forces band were helping set up the medical facilities and training to act as stretcher bearers and medical orderlies. Their instruments would now stay locked away until it was all over. Then, on May the 2nd, the British submarine Conqueror brought the reality of war home. From beneath icy waters just outside the British total exclusion zone, she saw, reported, and was then ordered to torpedo the Argentinian cruiser General Belgrano. 360 lives were lost when the 10,000-ton ship listed to port and sank. The rest of her navy took no further part in the war. 2 days later, Argentina took her revenge. 2 super-étendard fighter bombers popped up above the horizon just long enough to launch a missile against HMS Sheffield. The name of the missile was soon to strike fear into the heart of every British serviceman afloat: Exocet. At 300,000 pounds a shot, the French Exocet anti-ship missile was expected to be reliable and devastating. It was both. The Marines in Hermes saw their first casualties coming aboard from the still burning hulk of one of Britain's newest and most sophisticated warships. The burnt-out destroyer was to stay afloat for 6 more days before sinking, but already the questions were coming. How could it have happened? Why didn't the Sheffield's defences save her? Why wasn't damage control more effective? And why had sailors been issued with clothing that melted and stuck to the skin when on fire? The death of the Sheffield did nothing for morale, but it did a great deal for determination. The Milan anti-tank missile, the Marines now decided, could be put to other uses. If the Argentinians didn't provide tanks to fire at, the British realised that this wire-guided weapon could be used to terrible effect against stubbornly resisting trenches. The 66mm anti-tank missile launcher would also offer a defensive advantage in the forthcoming battles. But on the way south, the 66 was appreciated by both spectators and operators. Lectures on when and where to use the weapons were now eagerly attended. And there was an insatiable appetite for any information about the Falklands and their environment.
Then these twin peaks of twin sisters.
But before the brigade could start its work, air superiority had to be achieved. With no big jets like Phantoms or Tornadoes available, the responsibility rested solely on the Harriers. Bombing enemy positions would be one role, but far more vital was to be the outcome of dogfights against Argentinian fighters. The versatile Harriers and their Sidewinder missiles gave the British what was to be perhaps the most important advantage of the war. The Argentinian garrison at Port Stanley woke one morning to find the Harriers announcing that the British task force was now very close. The airfield was the sole target of the first raids, with a classic figure-of-8 squadron attack by planes from Hermes and Invincible 200 miles to the northeast. The defenders had expected to be attacked, but not so soon and not with such ferocity. The pilots had expected the anti-aircraft fire to be more intense and accurate, but there were few complaints that it wasn't. The effect was devastating both to the airfield defences and to Argentinian morale. But the Argentinians fooled British intelligence by putting mud on the runway to look like bomb craters from previous Vulcan raids. In fact, their flying operations were not stopped for a moment by damage to the runway, and supplies and personnel kept on arriving. The task force was now poised on the brink of an amphibious assault. The diplomatic process had failed, the losses of the big ships had hardened resolve on both sides, the SBS ashore were reporting that the Argentinians were not impregnable, and the government had secretly decided that a landing followed by recapture of the islands should be undertaken as soon as possible. There were many possible landing sites and all were discussed fully, but eventually one area stood out as the only viable option. San Carlos water was far enough away from the main Argentinian force to be safe from land-based counterattack. It was surrounded by hills, which made a secret approach possible, and attack by air difficult. The beaches were sheltered and of the right slopes for landing craft. Furthermore, the twin estuaries provided cover for the establishment of a secure beachhead and good ways out for the eventual breakout towards Stanley. The plan was for the brigade to make 4 separate landings from their assault ships, which crept into Falklands Sound under cover of darkness, preceded by a welcome fog the day before. This was May the 21st, 1982, a date no Marine who was there would ever forget. The Navy had kept its promise and delivered 3 Commando Brigade to exactly where it wanted to be. 40 Commando were to be the first ashore by landing craft, or LCU, from HMS Fearless. Their objective, the beach at Bonners Bay, codenamed after the colour of the unit's identifying shoulder lanyard, Blue Beach 1. 4-5 Commando from the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Stromness were to land across the water at the old refrigeration plant at Ajax Bay, Red Beach 1. 4-2 Commando were to stay in Canberra as Brigade Reserve, while 2 para made for the other side of San Carlos settlement to Blue Beach 2, and 3 para were landed near Port San Carlos at Green Beach 1.
Well, when you're on a boat and there's all sorts coming in there trying to get it, and you're sat on it doing absolutely nothing, trying to wait your turn to get off. It's hard to wait your turn. You want to get off because you feel a bit safer on the land. I couldn't have been a matlow and sat on a boat. No way.
When they'd keep you briefed up to date, they'd give you up-to-date briefs on the situation, like with the air attacks. We felt very vulnerable in the well deck with air attack, in the sense of it's like being in a tunnel, really. You just wait for it. If it's going to come in, it's yours anyway, so you just hope you're going to go quick and you don't end up with legs missing, I suppose. I think that's a lot of people are thinking. Rather than go without legs, just take me out quick, make it quick.
I remember looking along the ranks of all the lads as we were waiting to go over the scramble nets, and it was something like out of World War II. All the guys looking around, cammed out and waiting to go on. And it was quite eerie, really. We climbed down the scramble net into the LCUs, and we was all jam-packed in there. And it always struck me, our company commander, Captain Gardner at the time, as we went forward in the LCUs, there was planes having dogfights above us, and there was shells going down. And he walked to the front of the LCU, climbed up the ramp, sat there playing his mouth organ, his Scottish songs. Quite mad. We were just looking at the man in awe, basically, because he was a great bloke, and he was up there, and he knew the majority of us were a little bit frightened because it was the first time we'd actually been to war. And he thought that he'd show us how it's done, and he got up there and played his mouth organ.
We had the best part of a company, plus virtually the whole of the anti-tank and mortar platoons of support company, packed with all their kit. There wasn't room to sit down. There wasn't room to take off your kit. You stood in the landing craft, shoulder to shoulder, being held in position by all the people around you.
I remember sitting at the time, I was sitting on a crate of 81mm mortars, and we could hear actions coming off the way down in San Carlos and stuff like that. And I was saying, God, again, let's get off this LCU and get ashore.
Then the shot and the naval gunfire started on down at Fenning's Head. And before that started, I always remember saying to the lads within it, well, Maggie, get on that phone. You still got 5 minutes. You've still got time to get on that phone and cancel it if you're not quite sure. So the gunfire, I thought, well, it's too late now. No point in trying to phone up now. I thought, this is it. And then we started going in, and the bloke, you hear the blokes going, hear that machine gun fire in it? What machine gun fire? I can't hear nothing. All it was just blokes, I suppose it was blokes' imagination running, because First time for war for everybody.
We were sort of scared, sort of like because we didn't know what had happened, but we were willing to go in and do the business when it was called for.
I expected all the training we do, you leap out the landing craft, run up the beach, stacks of smoke, everybody screaming, and we just bimbled off. There was nobody there, we were just walking around. I was waiting for the shit to hit the fan and it just didn't. I was in the landing craft worrying about the fact that I had 2 blowpipe missiles and they were the first thing that was going to be ditched. But there was no need.
And the ramp went down, and this beach, I think, was about 6 foot wide. The actual embankment, like, you know. This combat engineering tractor came out and couldn't get off the beach because it had a big ramp there, like, you know, it was just stuck there and solid. We were just amazed at how big this beach was supposed to be, like, you know.
It was nice to get back on the old terra firma, onto dry land again. Although we're Marines and seaborne troops, etc., after tossing around in the South Atlantic for a few days, it was nice to get back where, to a certain extent, our destiny was in our own hands. We could fight on the land, whereas we relied upon the frigates, etc., when we were on board ship. And the feeling of the Commando, I think, when they landed was, you know, thank goodness for that. We can now get on with the job in hand. The ships, to their eternal credit, and at great cost to them, had done their bit. They'd got us into Ajax Bay, they'd got us into San Carlos, in an unopposed landing, and we managed to get ashore. And from there, I think the morale of the troops, or at least speaking for X-Company, was very, very high.
A couple of totally unimpressed local workers at San Carlos helped to raise the Union flag over their settlement to symbolically announce what was now a fact. The British were back. The flag was discreetly lowered the following day when senior officers thought it might prove too tempting an aiming point for the Argentinian pilots. The uneasy lull that followed in the next hours fooled nobody. Everyone knew the Argentinians would turn up soon enough and in strength to try to prevent the beachhead from getting established. Every man set to the vital task of digging his fire trench from where he could shoot at incoming aircraft from a position of relative safety. There was no elation at being on the Falklands at last, no sense of success. The first phase had gone easily, perhaps too easily, and it wasn't long before the first shouts of "Air raid warning red, air red" started to echo down the beaches and the new company positions. The Argentinians had indeed found them, and within a matter of minutes their air force was on its way. The ships huddled against the hills, but the Harriers were not there to protect them. And the Rapier air defence batteries were ashore, but not yet operationally ready for what was about to happen.
So we just sat on the top of the crest line, watching out, and we also had an excellent view of Bomb Alley, all the ships being formed up. Basically, there's an early warning for the aircraft coming in, so we could at least report back to give the lads who were actually digging at San Carlos some type of defence before everything came in. I can remember most of us spotted 7 or 8 Skyhawks and Mirages. They used to come in from all directions and form up in the Outer Verde. It was like a big base, and they all used to meet up there, and then they'd shoot off down towards Bomb Alley.
The courage and skill of the Argentinian pilots were beyond doubt. Even Marines who were trying their hardest to kill them held them in awe and respect. Time and again, the planes would return, defying everything the ships and the troops could throw at them. Their orders were to go for the warships, which was good news for the Canberra and the other merchant ships. The promised British air superiority became a joke among the Marines, as wave after wave of Skyhawks and Mirages ran the gauntlet up and down Bomb Alley as San Carlos water became known.
Sit on your top of your shell scrape, see the Mirages and Skyhawks coming in, like, you know, the ones that wouldn't make it, you know, disappear, blown to pieces, like, round of applause. You get the odd sneaky one that would come in, try a quick one at the lads on the land, and of course we had the Skyhawk one, which got Andrews. And I saw the Skyhawks coming in, and I saw Charlie Company, all their lads were actually sat out cooking a tea, like, cooking their meal. I just turned around, I saw this Skyhawk coming up, and I could see the red flashes. The 30-yard cannon is firing. I just shouted, aircraft, and that was it. We all scuffled in, just like rats climbing to holes. All scuffed down the cover. Heard the bombs, explosions, missiles trying to catch the aircraft that just gone over the top of us, trying to catch them up.
It was chaos, really. Everybody was just running around like headless chickens. because it took us completely by surprise, the first air raid. I got a message on the radio, I passed it to the post, and the aircraft had gone by the time they'd picked the equipment up. It was so fast.
And they kept doing that day after day,
Yeah.
and things got a lot better.
Oh yeah, we got it word off in the end.
In the end, what was it like?
The first missile I saw fired, which didn't do my morale any good, landed about 50 metres away from 4-5's mortar troop. They thought it was an aircraft actually crashing next to them. We went down, two of us went down about an hour later and asked them if they'd seen a missile, and we'd got quite a few nasty comments off them.
There's an air battle going on to the north. Air battle to the north.
Second raid at 50 miles west. I say again, the first raid at 40 miles west. The second raid at 50 miles west. Out.
Over half the aircraft was shot down, many of them by the now operational Rapier missiles. But the damage caused by the planes would have been far worse had all their bombs been armed correctly. The pilots who made it home gave San Carlos Water their own nickname, Death Valley. The frigate Antelope was hit by one of the many bombs which failed to explode. But this one did go off while being disarmed, and the race was then on to get her crew off before she sank. Rescue helicopters hovered in the swirling smoke, plucking the crew to safety. But the fire was out of control and soon reached the main magazine. The following morning, her back broken, the little ship burned out and then sank. Other bombs were successfully made safe, some in the most unorthodox of ways. This landing ship was evacuated, and then the still-armed 1,000-pound bomb was carefully winched out of the hold and delicately lowered into a rubber dinghy filled with cornflakes to act as a cushion. One bomb started a fire at the brigade maintenance area at Ajax Bay, inexplicably sited right next to the hospital. Amazingly, the medical staff kept on working. More disastrous was the sinking of the container ship Atlantic Conveyor with hundreds of tons of stores for the brigade. Most serious losses from the ship were 5 massive Chinook helicopters. Just this one was left. It meant hundreds of men would have to walk across the country instead of fly to meet the enemy. The decision to land at San Carlos proved to be the right one, inasmuch that no amount of attention from the Argentinian Air Force could prevent the British from gaining a cast-iron foothold. So, with men, equipment, and the brigade headquarters now ashore, the breakout eastwards could now be started. First to move were 2 para under the irrepressible Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones, who had an alarming habit of moving too far ahead for his own good on exercise, and thereby getting knocked out of the game. 2 para's victory and Jones's death at Goose Green were to be the first and most memorable actions of the campaign on the Falklands. It would be fair to say that after Goose Green, nobody in the task force, or indeed Britain, seriously doubted that a military victory over Argentina could and would be achieved. Goose Green proved that a conscript army could never match professional volunteers, and that British morale, already high, would keep rising, while Argentina hourly had to face the stronger prospect of humiliation and defeat. With 2 para taking a brief rest to lick their wounds, the rest of the brigade began their own moves towards the capital. 4-2 Commando were to move the fastest, with K and L companies being flown by helicopter to the western edge of the mountains protecting Stanley, and J Company followed by the same means, by way of Goose Green. 4-5 Commando did it the hard way, beginning what was to be a 90-mile route march, or YOMP, from Port San Carlos initially to Teal Inlet. 40 Commando were told to stay put and protect the beachhead. The weather was dreadful. The packs or bergens weighed up to 120 pounds each, the ground almost impossible to walk on. But at last, the brigade was on its way.
I've never carried as much kit. A typical Marine will sort of, when he packs to go anywhere, he will pack his bergen, put it on, take it off, empty it out, throw away 1 or 2 items, and then pack it again. We couldn't do that. We took ammunition. All the luxuries went. All the luxury items went. And it was basically rations and ammunition. And we had a lot of initially a lot of sprains and twists, simply not due to unfitness or bad ground. It was simply due to the phenomenal weight that the guys were carrying. And as you know, the slog out of San Carlos is uphill initially, and the track isn't the best of tracks. And it was hard work, very hard work indeed. And all the time there was the threat of air attack. So you had to constantly be alert, as well as putting one foot in front of the other with these phenomenal weights we were carrying.
I thought morale itself was quite high, but you had an urge just to get that Bergen off your back and rest. That's a great feeling, what everybody thought. When yomping, you do your 10 minutes stop every hour. Of course, you know, I've seen blokes just sort of wouldn't take the Bergens off. It was too much of an effort to put them back on again. You know, about sitting down and having to stand up again. It was a problem. Because we had actually been yomping for a fair bit, and then we got told, right, rest, there's choppers coming. Because this is a sort of an old thing with 4-5 now, there's choppers on the way, and you never get there, you know. And of course, you know, right, the choppers aren't coming, we're moving again. And we yomped all the way through that night, following this long barrier fence, you know, just great big long fence, a good 5 or 6 kilometers long. And that was quite horrendous, you know. I reckon that was about the worst part of the yomp, the actual initial first night. It was pouring down with rain. And it was really difficult going. Very wet. So of course there was a problem trying to keep your feet some sort of reasonably dry. But the lads who actually sort of hurt themselves at night time, and I had to carry on. Or get left behind. One of the two.
I'll always remember the first night, which was spent at a small settlement, just short of a small settlement. In the pouring rain, we eventually stopped to get a couple of hours rest, and we'd cross marshes and bogs, and it was nose to the back of the man in front of you, basically, which isn't tactically sound, but in the weather conditions we were getting at the time, was the only thing we could do. Carrying the weights we were carrying, we just couldn't have covered the distance unless we'd covered it in a snake formation. We eventually flopped down in a commando circle, something which I've never seen before and hope I never see again. The whole commando group with TAC headquarters in the centre. It was a bit like the Little Bighorn, really, the thin green circle. And we lay down sort of side by side and tried to get a little bit of sleep. It was pouring with rain. Every item of kit you had was soaked. You were tired physically and mentally. And the couple of hours sleep we did get passed all too quickly. And we still had sentry duties, etc., and air sentries and things to supply. That was a bit of a low point because everyone was physically drained. And the decision was made then to discard some of the kit and move quickly.
The quickest way, of course, was by helicopter, but these were now so scarce that only heavy equipment had the luxury of a free lift. The big 105mm guns were now being moved forward, so that 2-9 Commando, the Royal Artillery, could at last begin to pour shells into the Argentinian horseshoe defence in the mountains to the west of Port Stanley. Every helicopter far exceeded its permitted load maximum and flying hours as the ammunition and stores were put in place, ready for what was to be the biggest British artillery barrage since the Second World War. Conditions were far worse several hundred feet above sea level, and the commanders knew the Marines could not be kept here too long before making the decisive move. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and wet kit could not be dried out. In 4-2 Commando alone, over 3/4 of the men suffered from trench foot. But although the Argentinians had given up most of East Falkland, one small thorn remained in the British side, Top Marlow House, which the Mountain and Arctic Warfare Cadre of the Royal Marines was ordered to clear. The devastation after their raid was proof enough of their success. An Argentinian section had been caught unawares, but then fought stubbornly. Many of them died, and the house was completely destroyed before at last a brigade could claim to have total control of all the land between San Carlos and the mountains. The route to Stanley now had to be decided, and the thinking of the brigade staff was greatly helped by an Argentinian defensive plan which had been found in an abandoned trench. The obvious route was to the south of the mountains, but that was discounted as being what the Argentinians would have expected, and therefore blocked with minefields. It also did not give the brigade enough elbow room to manoeuvre properly or get the artillery properly placed for the final phase. So it was to be a full-scale, three-pronged assault on the mountains themselves. A high, freezing barrier between the flat, boggy waste to the west and the island's capital to the east. The Argentinians had all the advantages: possession of the high ground, easy access to their main supplies in Stanley, well-placed heavy artillery to back them up, and more men and supplies arriving daily from the mainland. It was little wonder they'd put all their hopes in this last defensive ring. 3 Commando Brigades' plan was, on the face of it, almost impossible against such odds, but the commanders put enormous faith in the single fact that their men were far better trained, more determined, and better suited to the dreadful conditions. The attacks on 3 key features, Mount Longdon, 2 Sisters, and Mount Harriet, were to be simultaneous and in the darkness of the night of June the 12th. 3 Para would take Mount Longdon, and 4-5 Commando the 2 Sisters. 4-2 Commando would tackle Mount Harriet. Each unit would plan its own attack individually, with the provisos that they all started at the same time and didn't get in each other's way on the way to or during the battles. 2 Para would wait in reserve in case 4-5 Commando or 3 Para needed any help. Then they would push on ahead once the objectives had been taken. Now was the last chance to load up with ammunition and check that weapons and equipment were in full working order. The men knew they were about to go into battle, something none of them had ever been through before. Yet the mood was calm and quiet. The positions from which the assaults would start were well protected and in the rocks. The battles would be fought from open ground. The prospect was not a cheery one. First, though, the enemy was to be pounded with artillery.
Correct. 6-8 mil, 6-8 mil, set, elevation, 4-2-4 mil. Ready, fire! Back!
It was later proved that the guns had been incredibly accurate from over 10 miles distance. Further softening up of the targets was achieved by fighting patrols going forward to both observe and report on enemy positions and to harass them wherever possible. These missions didn't always go according to plan.
We got within 50 metres of the base of it, and one of the blokes in the front said, "Stop," by hand signal, so we all stopped. We all went to ground, and it came back. There's a sentry up front, and we're all peering through the gloom of the dark light, and there were 6 of these blokes. You could just see them, they were all talking and mincing up and down, carrying weapons. One of them then lit a cigarette up, and they were talking away. So we decided we'd try and push around this bend and get into some cover, because we were well out in the open at the moment, and they'd not seen us. Me and a bloke called Graham Fisk just snaked over the top of this little hole on our stomachs and crawled along some jagged type rocks. So between me and him, there's a little row of rocks that look like the back of a dinosaur. And we're just crawling along, trying to get towards these 6 who were shooting at us, because we were behind them now. And this little voice in the dark said, "Steve, I can see one." And I hadn't realised at the time that when we'd gone over the top, he'd pulled a 66 out and made it ready. So, I mean, my immediate reaction was, well, hit him, you know. So the next thing I know is a 66 goes off and he blows my head off, you know, because he fired at this bloke with a 66. And it hit him, went through him and detonated behind this rock and totally blew him to pieces. And if you've ever imagined in the middle of a gunfight, I mean, I was so annoyed that he'd fired this 66, I actually gave him a bollock in the middle of a firefight. And then these others must have thought, well, he's gone, we'll try and snake out. And what they did was they came round the same way, and instead of getting back up onto Harriet, they walked straight into me and him. So, I mean, it was like a duck shoot. So 6 of them went down.
The information about the Argentinian positions from such patrols was passed on to the rest of the men who were about to go into battle. A great deal had been found out.
We know how they're going to reinforce themselves, because on the slopes of Mount Kent, feature at the back, they left a tented area which contained their op orders for the defence of this area. Right? And they are prepared to lose 50% of their supporting troops. Right, their quick reaction force. So they're going to take this quite seriously. The guns are staying here, sir, until they can secure a further area, suitable area forward. There's no reason for them to move at the moment because we can just sit back and bomb shit out of them from here.
As the advances to the mountains started, the Argentinians started bringing down artillery fire. But the British advance was not held up, and every unit was in position on time for the start of the battle for the mountains, and indeed for the Falklands themselves.
There's a lot of things you wanted to say, and you didn't have time. You wanted to go and shake the hand of every man in your troop. You wanted to have a word with the other troop sergeants and say, you know, good luck. Because we wouldn't see each other again until after the battle, if everything had gone well. But there wasn't time. It's at a time like that you realise that there's a lot of things you wish you'd said. You know, or you'd probably given a bollocking to a guy a couple of hours before, and you thought, Christ, I can't have him going up the feature thinking that, you know, he's on a bit of a downer. And you wanted to go up and say, oh, forget it, you know, it's nothing. You didn't have time.
The attack by 4-5 Commando on Two Sisters was, as the geography would suggest, in two simultaneous thrusts. The 600 men moved up to the mountain from the left under cover of darkness and got to within firing distance before being seen. Their upward assault never lost its momentum, but by the end of the battle, 4 Royal Marines had died.
We was actually being pinned down by these machine guns, and myself and tough spears, we just legged it up forward, putting down fire all the time, and managed to get in a good position as to silence the machine gun. If we're doing Royal Marines, or basically any British soldier in that position, then nobody would have taken it, because it was well dug in, well concealed, and it was a pretty good position. Because they had their actual position covering every angle of attack. It's just that they didn't have the backbone to stay there and carry it out. When we actually got up there into the positions, there was dead, and they'd left dead behind, but there was no actual live prisoners. They'd all legged it back into Stanley.
4-2 Commando had advanced along a fence line to the south of Mount Harriet, unseen by the defenders, who'd expected to be attacked from the opposite direction. The plan was to hook round up and onto the mountains, then sweep the Argentinians off from right to left. The idea of going back to Mount Harriet did not enthrall Steve Newland.
And then they said, you're going to hit this again. And I mean, there's nothing you can say, you're just stunned. You know, I mean, and then you're trying to explain, but we've been there, we've done this already, you know, but they weren't having it, we were going to do it again. Probably we didn't do it right the first time. We'd been briefed already that to stop meant we'd lost, so you couldn't afford to stop. So Sharky came up on the net and said, he was talking to the boss, and he said, look, we're pinned down by a sniper, and apparently, you know, I mean, that was what he thought it was. Now, I'd worked out, in relation to where he was, to where I was, that this bloke should have been somewhere up above me. So, being, you know, putting 1 and 1 makes 5, I'd worked out that we'd go and get him. So while I'm trying to brief my section as to what we're going to do, there was an incoming stomp. So naturally, they all took cover. And in the dark, I never realised that they'd all took cover. And my 2IC Shep was supposed to be coming with me. So I said, okay, Shep, we'll go. Not realising that he was on the deck, you know, covering his head. Because I was surrounded by these massive rocks by this stage. So I just started off on my own in the dark, climbed up this smally cliff, went over the top of it, around some more boulders, snaked about a bit, and went up to link up with L Company, who were on our left then. So I linked up with L Company and said, look, I'm going up a bit further. For God's sake, don't shoot me, you know, because in the dark. They said, yeah, all right, but I don't think they really took much notice because they were a bit busy. So I carried on, got right to the top, looked round this rock, and instead of there being a single sniper, there was a whole row of them all lined out behind this like tabletop rock. And what they were doing was taking turns at shooting. So to our lads, it must have looked like this bloke was a switched-on sniper, and every time he fired one round, he moved, because that was all they were doing. And what they were waiting for was our lot to break cover, and they were going to mow them down with a gun that was on the end. So I saw all this, and I turned around to say to Shep, you know, Will, and he wasn't there. So now I'm all by myself, and I'm thinking, oh shit, you know, like you do. And I could see about 13 bodies. Now apparently the rest of them were around the corner, but I couldn't see them. So I thought, well, you're up here now. There's nowhere to go. You can't go back down because you'll mix it with L Company. You can't go across because you don't know what's up there. So your only way out is to hit them. So by this time, Sharky's, you know, what you're doing about it? And I said, well, this is what I've got, and this is what I'm going to do. And he said, okay. So I then just took out the 2 grenades that I had left, changed mags, got a fresh mag ready. I put the FOSS grenade went first, and it went at the people, and then the HE grenade went to the gun. And when I just peered around the corner, the FOSS had worked a fair bit, and the gun had been decimated, and the 2 blokes who were up, they'd gone. And then as soon as they'd gone off, I just walked around the corner and fired at anything that moved. It got 3 rounds. Then Sharky came up and said, they're giving up, but we're going to put 266s in to make sure. And because it might have been another one of these smally traps, like. So I'm in here now, and I'm thinking, hang on a minute, like. So I said, wait out, and I'll get out. And as I ran out and dived in this little hole, I just said, let it go, and 266s whistled in. And he said, you know, it's clear. Can you go back to where you were and make sure that they don't get out the back? Because the ones that I couldn't see were still alive, you see. And as I went back round this corner, one of these blokes that I'd hit him about here, and he'd spun and gone down, but he wasn't dead. And as I walked around the corner, he just squeezed a burst from an FN, took me in both legs. He then died rather suddenly because I was a bit upset then. I got out, sat down, dropped my weapon, looked down at both legs, and in the dark you can't tell which is the worst one. So I pulled out the one first field dressing that I had left. And then you're trying to make a command decision now. Which one do I bandage, you know? Because I couldn't tell in the dark. They both were hurt. And I ditched the first field dressing in temper because I didn't know which one to do it on. And I thought, right, I'll sit here and wait for Sharky. So I got on the radio again and said, Sharks, can you get to me? And he said, yeah, sure, I'll be there in a minute. I'm just taking some prisoners.
4-2 Commando's attack was a complete success. Corporal Newland won the military medal, and scores of prisoners were brought down to be disarmed and processed. The war for them and everyone else, it was hoped, was now over. Wounded Argentinians were treated alongside wounded Marines at the Ajax Bay Field Hospital, where not one patient died from either side throughout the war. The medical squadron had set a precedent that would be hard to follow. At last, the victorious Marines could see their objective, Port Stanley. But British guns were now trying to knock out Argentinian artillery positioned in between civilian homes in the town. Tragically, 3 Falklanders died in this, the last exchange of the campaign. They were the first and last civilian casualties. At last, it began to look as though it really was all over. Rumours were rife that the Argentinians had surrendered. Somebody said that white flags were flying over Stanley. In fact, they weren't. But as the Marines marched down off the mountains through an unmarked Argentinian minefield towards the capital, nobody doubted the fighting had finished. Brigadier Julian Thompson, the man who'd led 3 Commando Brigade, was one of the first to arrive.
Well, the situation is that we are in Stanley, and I understand that the General is going forward to talk to General Menendez in about half an hour. Now, what he's going to say to him, I don't know, and what the exact position is, I'm not fully aware, but all I do know is that the shooting has stopped. We've overrun their main gun positions, and they have taken themselves to the other end of town.
It looks on the face of it as though General Menendez is on the point of surrender. Is that the way you see it at the moment?
Well, I wouldn't like to put it like that just yet. Let's wait until we actually hear the words before we start uttering them.
It's been a very fast move over the last 24 hours.
Very fast move, indeed.
Has it surprised you the speed at which it's happened?
I thought it might go this way, and one was getting oneself ready for it. I didn't think it would happen quite as fast as this. I expected this to be happening tomorrow and not today, but I'm delighted that it's happened today.
Within a couple of hours, without any celebration or applause, the Argentinians signed the surrender. Their gamble had failed. At enormous cost, the British had re-established their sovereignty. Yet, as the Marines marched into Stanley, they could be forgiven for wondering why none of the inhabitants came out to even say thank you. Major Mike Norman and the rest of his detachment, who were defeated 2.5 months previously, were given the honour of replacing the Union flag outside Government House. The vanquished in the ultimate gesture of defeat, the laying down of arms before their conquerors. The beaten army, like the Marines, seemed to have little energy left for emotion. It was all over, and everyone, it seemed, was glad to be soon going home. Some, though, took it harder than others. It was an inglorious, pitiful wait for the Argentinians, knowing there would be no welcome for them when they got back. To make matters worse for them, their meagre rations were on the point of running out. The enlisted men didn't even have their daily packs of tripe, crackers and a prayer card. The officers at least had cigarettes, tuna fish and a bottle of whiskey in their packs. With all dignity gone, the Argentinians, in frustration, defiled the streets of Stanley before being ordered to clear up on their way to the boats back home. Their adventure was over. The world had witnessed Britain's response to their attempt to take the Falklands by force. It was the end to their ambitions and their credibility. But worst of all, they'd lost face. So it was the end, too, for General Galtieri's military junta. The Royal Marines left for home in somewhat happier mood.
In reality, being honest with yourself, I mean, that's what you joined up for, really. I don't know if someone's gung-ho and stuff like that, but I mean, you know, that's exactly what you joined up for. And it came your way, so, you know, you were lucky.
I equate it to being like a guard dog, and you're always chained up. Then one day they unchain you. That's it. That's what you do.
So I'll have a few stories when I get nice and old. But I am glad I went down there, and I'm glad for what the Corps did. The Corps did quite well down there. And it's given a lot of blokes experience of actually being under fire. And we need that in the Corps, because that's our job, sorting out little wars, or big ones.
I've seen my company grow up. They've had their baptism of fire, and we took out boys, we brought back men.
The welcome Britain gave to Canberra and the Marines when they came home on July the 11th was the greatest outpouring of patriotic emotion, gratitude, and, for the relatives of those who'd been away, relief anyone could ever remember. A welcome of sorts had been expected, but nothing on the scale as gigantic as this. Marines who'd been sorry the night before to sail past their homes in Plymouth now realised why. Everyone in Plymouth, it seemed, had come to Southampton. Some people wondered why the politicians of the world had allowed the Falklands War to happen at all. Others wondered, and still wonder, if it was all worth it, or if the long-term cost of re-establishing Britain's sovereignty would prove to be too high. But those were questions to be argued about some other time. Today, it was just great to be home, to remember those who did not make it back. And perhaps to proudly remind the world that the Royal Marines had quite simply done once again what they'd set out to do. And no one could argue with that.